Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. What a beautiful day it is in D.C. If you haven't gone out, it is beautiful. I'm Matt Ammon. I'm with HUD's Office of Policy Development and Research, and I, on behalf of HUD and Secretary Carson, welcome those here in the Brooke Mondale Auditorium and also to those watching online via webcast. Today is June 1, and I know I was a bit shocked. June 1. I mean, where has the time gone? I looked outside today and I still see my Christmas lights up, those little icicles hanging up. I don't know whether to take them down or just leave them up at this point, but we'll see. But June is here. President Trump issued a proclamation today declaring June 2017 as National Homeownership Month. And as the president said in his proclamation, homeownership is often the foundation of security and prosperity for families and communities, and an enduring symbol of American freedom. Today we mark the beginning of National Homeownership Month with a housing forum examining a new era of homeownership. We have an exciting program planned for today that includes data, dialogue, and a whole bunch of experts to discuss the state of homeownership and to take your questions. But first, it's a pleasure for me to introduce the host of today's forum, HUD Secretary Ben Carson, who will kick off today's events. Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you all. Delighted to be here, and so happy to see so many people here today. You know, a lot of people have wondered, why would you, a surgeon, be interested in HUD and in home ownership? Well, you know, my entire professional career spent trying to give children a second chance. Many days and nights spent trying to give them life and quality of life, only to send them back into a rotten environment. Now, this is an opportunity to work on that environment, to come full circle. You know, I'm pleased to see so many people here today. And I want to thank all those who've worked so hard to put this forum together. I especially like to thank our panelists who have joined us today: Joel Kahn, Christy Peel, John Spader, and Lawrence Yoon, with our moderator, Diana Olick, all distinguished, respected voices who will bring to us very valuable insight. People thrive in a marketplace of ideals. Today, this is our marketplace. We can use our exchange of ideals to make our work better, more human, stronger, and more effective. Today marks the beginning of National Home Ownership Month, a time when we recognize the abiding value of home ownership and rededicate ourselves to making sure that hardworking, credit-worthy Americans have an opportunity to become homeowners. The importance of home ownership is apparent to all of us. Security, certainty, safety, wealth creation, a path forward, self-sufficiency, a place to live with loved ones, to raise our families, the location of our neighborhood. And our homes are the places where our kids, our friends, our pets, our relatives create their worlds. In our homes, we live and grow and thrive together as one. Our founding fathers linked property with happiness and life itself. It is the essence of freedom, the stake in the city and the political system. They saw that home ownership was as vital as commercial, trade, and community. It is the foundation of the economy, the spark for vast investment, lending, and finance. Recently, Reuters published an article entitled "Housing Recovery Intact." Indeed it is. After the turbulence of 2008, the market has become relatively stable, secure, and sound. The system clearly is functioning. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely. More stability, more growth? Absolutely. But the big shifts that we were seeing have settled down. There's a steady upward climb, and the cycles have become much less dramatic. And we're seeing good news in startups, sales, demand, labor, mortgage rates, stocks, building, turnover, inventory, among the many sides of home ownership. Currently, home ownership rate is 63.6%. In some states, home ownership is above 70%. And first-time home buyers now make up 35% of all home buyers in the last 12 months. Now, these figures represent more than paper, facts, titles, and mortgages. We can see hopes and dreams and aspirations and excitement of home ownership building in our country. And we know that home ownership is the thread that runs through most every aspect of our economy and our nation. This good news will continue. The Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies projects that the United States will add 13.6 million households over the next 8 years, and another 11.5 million in the decade that follows that. I'm pleased to say that our own Federal Housing Administration has a strong role to play. The FHA has helped more than 46 million Americans purchase and refinance their homes. An estimated 40% of all first-time home buyers use FHA. And in fact, during our time here today, 4,000 new homeowners will be assisted in their closing by FHA. Just to put that in perspective. Now, of course, there are always going to be some who find bad news and good news. That's part of the marketplace of ideals. We must listen and learn. They worry about lending patterns and down payments, interest rates, rates of borrowing, rates of interest, and many of the other sides of home ownership. And I certainly appreciate those concerns, and we must heed the warnings and the worries. But we must be prudent and wise, far-reaching and visionary. We want to make sure that home ownership is on solid ground now and in the future. We need ethical behavior and risk within smart boundaries and best practices personally and financially. We must follow those practices that are fair, responsible, transparent, and prudent. The bankers, lenders, and investors are not playing with monopoly money. They're playing with hard-earned money of our citizens, and they've been entrusted to safeguard that money. And we must hold them to their duties, fiduciary and otherwise, not just in words, but actions and investments. As we learned in 2008, the consequences of irresponsible behavior are national and international. Yes, international. Our work has far-reaching impact from Helsinki to Hong Kong, from Cairo to Cape Town. And our homeownership policies are examined in places like Iceland, Switzerland, Jordan, and Australia. That's what I mean when I say worldwide. We are under the international microscope. People looking at what happens here. In many ways, the American housing market ripples through the economies of each company, every enterprise, and every country around the planet. In the last few weeks, I've had an opportunity to meet with ambassadors and housing authorities from a number of countries to share ideas about how we can make things better for all of us. Let me add a personal comment to our HUD employees. Our words and actions are weighed, scrutinized, and evaluated worldwide every day. That's one reason why our work is so important. We represent America to the nation and to the world. Your hard work matters. So this topic, home ownership, couldn't be more important and more timely. You're going to be treated to a panel discussion with some real experts in this subject. And I want to thank them once again for joining us today. And again, thank all of you for coming. And thanks to each one of you for your work to enhance self-sufficiency, freedom, independence, wealth creation, and the future security of American homeowners. Thank you.
Secretary, thank you for your leadership and for your opening remarks. A little bit of housekeeping. A little later on in the program, we'll be fielding your questions from those assembled here, both in Brook Mondale and also online. So we have two ways you can submit questions. One is by email at findyourplace@hud.gov, findyourplace@hud.gov, one word, and on Twitter using the hashtag #findyourplace. So before we get into the dialogue and discussion part of the program, I thought we'd take a quick look at the housing and market data and what it is telling us. So for that, we turn to our PD&R's own Kevin Kane. Kevin is our Chief Housing Market Analyst who will walk us through market conditions as of the first quarter 2017. Kevin?
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. They always say that at a conference you don't want to talk after the smartest guy in the room, so I guess I drew the short straw talking after the neurosurgeon. But at least the panel members won't have that same dilemma that they'll have to deal with after coming after me. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Randall Goodnight and Wendy Ip, who are two of our field economists for HUD, who put together all the maps that you'll see in my presentation this afternoon. First, we're going to look at the nation's economy, then we'll look at the sales and rental markets, and finally, we'll discuss a little bit about home ownership. The first figure that you're going to see here, let me slide back here. A little sensitive on the button. First figure shows the year-over-year percentage change in non-farm payroll since 2007, looking at both the 12-month and 3-month moving averages through March of 2017. Non-farm payrolls are a measure of the number of jobs in the economy. The 12-month average is shown in blue, and the 3-month average is shown in red. During the 12 months ending March 2017, non-farm payrolls averaged 145 million jobs. This was up 1.7%, or 2.4 million jobs from a year ago. The rate of growth was down from a 2% rate a year ago. And the 3-month year-over-year average through March was up by 1.6%, and that compares with 1.9% a year ago. Growth was strongest in the western regions of the country and in the southeast, and when I refer to the regions, I'm talking about the HUD-defined regions. The northwest region led growth at 2.4%. This next map shows the percentage change in home sales during the 12 months ending in March 2017. Sales market conditions around the country remain relatively balanced, with tighter markets in the Northwest, the Rocky Mountains, and the Great Plains. And just as a bit of background, balanced conditions exist when the quantity of housing supplied equals the quantity demanded. Soft markets occur when the quantity of housing supplied exceeds the quantity demanded, and we have a surplus of housing. And tight markets exist when demand exceeds supply, and we have a shortage of housing. Based on CoreLogic data, new and existing home sales were up by 1% during the 12 months ending March 2017 compared with a year ago. New home sales were up by 5%, and traditional resales, which exclude REO sales and short sales, were up by 4%, while REO and short sales were down by 19% and 15% respectively. REO stands for real estate owned, which means that the lender now owns the property. Sales were up or unchanged in every region of the country, except for a 2% decline in the Southwest and a 1% decline in the Rocky Mountains. You can see both of those regions highlighted in brown. The largest increases occurred in the Pacific and in the New England. Both were up by 5%. Inventories of new homes for sale were up by 9% from a year ago, and they were down 7% for existing homes. And the supply of existing homes continues to decline. The sales vacancy rate was 1.7% in the first quarter. This was unchanged from a year ago. Foreclosures and delinquencies continue to decline around the country. On a national level, 2.5% of all homes were 90 or more days delinquent in foreclosure or in REO as of March 2017. This is down from a rate of 3.2% in March of 2016. And the rate continues to decline in every region of the country, which has been the trend now for the last 3 years. The rate does remain the highest in the New York, New Jersey region at 5.3%, despite a 1.4 percentage point decline from last year. Now we're going to look at home prices based on the 3 most popular home price indices. All 3 home price indices show that home sales prices continue to increase in the first quarter of 2017. This figure shows the year-over-year change in the home price indices on a monthly basis. And all 3 indexes have shown year-over-year price increases since early 2012, where you can see all 3 of those lines up above that 0 mark. In March of 2017, the CoreLogic Index, which is shown in black, was up by 7% from a year ago, while the FHFA Index in red and the S&P Index in blue were up by 6% relative to a year ago. This map shows the change in the monthly CoreLogic Index on a state level from 1 year ago. Again, nationally, the increase was 7%, and prices were up in all states except for Alaska and West Virginia, which are shown in brown, and in Mississippi, where prices remained unchanged. In Alaska and West Virginia, the decline was very slight by only 1%. Prices in the 2 lighter shades of blue increased by less than or equal to the national average, and prices in the darkest shade of blue were up by more than the national average. And that was led by Washington State with an increase of 13%, and Utah, where prices were up by 10%. The largest increases were concentrated in the Northwest, and according to the Census Bureau, the median price of a new home in the first quarter was down by 2% from a year ago. And according to our friends at the National Association of Realtors, the median price of an existing home was up by 7% from a year ago. Let's take a brief look now at the rental markets around the nation. All regions in the country have rental markets with tight or slightly tight conditions, except for in the Southwest. This has the highest regional vacancy rate. In this map, we take a look and we see that based on Reese data, the national vacancy rate was 4.3% in the first quarter, and vacancy rates ranged from 3.2% in New York, New Jersey to 5.5% in the Southwest. Regions that are in brown were at or below the national average, and regions in blue were above the national rate. And according to Reese data, the national vacancy rate was unchanged from a year ago. But the rate has declined significantly from 2009 when it was 8%. And this is at the same period of time as when the rate of homeownership began to decline. The rate declined to around 4.4% in 2013, and the vacancy rate has remained stable since then. And according to the Census Bureau, for the entire U.S., the rental vacancy rate was 7% in the first quarter, and that was also unchanged from a year ago. When we take a look at rents across the country, rents were up by 3.2% nationally according to Reese, and despite the increase, rent gains have slowed relative to 2015 and 2016 when rents were increasing by about 6% a year. Rents grew in all regions of the country. You can see the whole country is in blue. The 6 regions in darker blue increased faster than the national average, led for the 7th consecutive quarter by the Northwest, where rents were up by 6.8%. Reese covers 274 market areas, and rents increased in 255 of those 274 areas over the past year. Now let's take a quick look at building permits. Single-family permits here are shown in blue, and multifamily are shown in orange. The number of single-family homes permitted nationally was up by 13% during the first quarter relative to a year ago. Permits were up in all regions except for a slight decline of 2% in the Northwest, But to put that into proper context, the Northwest had a very large increase the year before. It was up by 22%. 6 regions had a double-digit increase, led by the Southwest, which was up by 17%. The number of multifamily units permitted, again shown in orange, declined by 3% nationally. And the number of units permitted was up in 6 regions, led by a 41% gain in the Rocky Mountains and a 35% increase in New York, New Jersey. The number of multifamily units permitted declined in the other 4 regions, led by a 23% decline in the Pacific. So in summary of the market conditions, year-over-year job growth for the first quarter was 1.6%. Sales markets remained relatively balanced throughout the country, with some areas of tightness. Home prices continued to increase in the first quarter, and total sales increased by 1%. Rental market conditions remained tight or slightly tight in many markets around the country, and rents increased by more than 3% nationally, while vacancy rates remained stable. And now let's talk a little bit about home ownership. Here we see the annual home ownership rate from 1965 to 2016. And from 1965 to 1994, the home ownership rate averaged 64%. We see that it began to increase in 1995 and reached a peak of 69% in 2004. Since 2005, the rate declined until reaching a rate of 63.4% in 2016. This large decline in the home ownership rate since 2005 also coincides with the decline in the national vacancy rate since 2009, as a lot of these households switched from being homeowners moving to the rental side of the market. We have a very significant development that we've seen in the first quarter of 2017 regarding new household formation. The number of new owner households outnumbered the number of new renter households for the first time since the fourth quarter of 2006. So possibly showing that some of these trends may be switching. We may be moving back towards more home ownership at this point. This map shows the home ownership rate for the first quarter of 2017 at the state level. Nationally, the home ownership rate during the first quarter was 63.6%. States in the 2 shades of blue have a higher home ownership rate than the national average, while the states in brown have rates that are lower than the national average. Rates ranged from lows of 42, 52, and 54% in DC, New York State, and Nevada, to highs of 74% in Minnesota and 75% in South Carolina and West Virginia. The rate in California is 55%, while 8 states have a rate that's above 70%. And finally, let's consider the impact of millennials moving forward, which I know a number of our members of the panel are going to be discussing. This table shows the home ownership rate by 3 different generations: baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials, when they were in certain age cohorts. You can see that when baby boomers and Gen Xers were in that 25 to 34-year-old age group, their home ownership rate was higher than for the millennials in that same group. You can see the baby boomers had a rate of 41%, the Gen Xers 40%, whereas the millennials at 35%. The reason that it was lower for the millennials is probably for a variety of different reasons: the housing market downturn, the Great Recession, as well as rising levels of debt amongst young folks. But as people get older, the home ownership rate increases. And you can see that with the baby boom generation and the Gen Xers. As they moved into that 35 to 54-year age group, their home ownership rate went up. So we expect to see a similar kind of increase with the millennials, but we're not really sure by how much that's going to increase. And I'm going to leave that to the panel members to discuss in more detail. If you'd like additional information, please go to the U.S. Housing Market Conditions website, which is at huduser.gov. You can talk with your local regional or field economist, or you can feel free to get in touch with me. Thank you very much, and at this point, I'll hand things back to Matt.
Thank you, Kevin, for that information analysis. Now I'd like to invite our panel of experts up to the stage now for today's forum. And as we do that, I want to, as a reminder, tell you that we'll be fielding questions later in the program. And there are two ways you can submit your questions. First, by email at findyourplace@hud.gov, and on Twitter using the hashtag findyourplace. Again, email findyourplace@hud.gov, and on Twitter using the hashtag findyourplace. And you can also get updates via social media by following at HUD User News and at HUD.gov. Now, introducing our panelists. John Spader is a Senior Research Associate for Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies. Those are the folks who produce the widely respected annual State of the Nation's Housing Report. And the 2017 report will be released in a couple of weeks. So John, welcome. Christine Peel is the Executive Director of the Center for New York City Neighborhoods, a housing counseling organization that works directly with people and families hoping to buy a home or hoping to keep their homes. Christine brings an important consumer voice to our panel today. Christine, thank you for being here. Dr. Lawrence Yoon is the Chief Economist and Senior Vice President of Research for the National Association of Realtors. And of course, the realtors are, of course, on the front lines of homeownership, on the ownership marketplace, and Dr. Yoon's insights will be most valuable to today's discussion. And we can't discuss homeownership without the financing needed to buy a home. For that, we're happy to welcome Joel Kahn, Associate Vice President of Industry Surveys and Forecast for the Mortgage Bankers Association. And now our moderator. Diana Olick is an Emmy Award-winning real estate reporter for CNBC. Diana reports on our nation's housing markets. She's fluent in the issues we'll be discussing today, and most importantly, she asks very probing questions, which would be helpful. Diana, welcome. I turn the program over to you.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me and for having all of us. Thank you all for being here. I would like to start with a tweet, because that's what we do nowadays. When we were sitting back there waiting, I tweeted out that I was at the Homeownership Forum, and I said that President Trump had declared June National Homeownership Month, and I got some replies. And I'd like to read you one from somebody that says, "It's amazing that the policy push to a, quote, ownership society in the 2000s has now fueled a rental society." And I think that's a great place to kick off, because we talked a lot in the early days about homeownership society, pushing homeownership to a point where perhaps too many people got into homes that shouldn't have been there, who couldn't afford them. We know what happened to the mortgage market. And now we're back here talking once again after the biggest crisis, at least I've ever seen and most of us ever have, about home ownership again and how to promote home ownership. So I'd actually like to start with Christy, because you're down there in the neighborhoods. You're talking to the people who perhaps would like to be homeowners. In your opinion, how important to a person's health, wealth, and future is being a homeowner?
Well, thank you, Diana, and thank you to HUD for having us all here, especially Secretary Carson and the Office of Homeownership Counseling. As a HUD-approved housing counseling agency, I just need to thank the leadership of Sarah Drake, who leads that office, as well as the Office of PDR. So when we think about homeownership, we've obviously learned a lot from the foreclosure crisis. The Center for New York City Neighborhoods mission is to promote and protect affordable homeownership. So a lot of the work that we do is helping homeowners keep their homes. But when we look at what people's options are relative to other housing availability, homeownership is a really important strategy, and it's also an important strategy for building wealth. So while it's not the only solution, we think it's a really critical solution. It's also really important as we're looking at some really significant gaps in asset building among different racial groups. So it's not the only solution, but it's a really critical solution, and it's one that we fight for every day because we see the benefits that it can have. In a lot of markets, owning a property can have a lower housing cost than renting. It's more stable. You have the ability to invest in your community over the long term. And often homeowners provide lower market rents than investor owners. So we think homeownership is a critical strategy. We think we can do it better. We can learn from what we went through with the foreclosure crisis. We can be smart about how we counsel homeowners. as they're looking to buy, and we can think really strategically about how to support homeowners over the life of the loan. So it's a great strategy. It's not the only strategy, but we always say that coming out of the crisis, we can't reject an entire class of assets for building communities and building family wealth.
And to that end, what would you like to see from government today? Because from the current government, we hear a lot about public-private partnerships, and I just actually interviewed the secretary who said, you know, government money should be seed money, but really it needs to be public-private partnerships because that's where the wealth for housing comes from, is the private sector. Do you agree with that?
Well, the typical homeownership, the typical family buying a home is a public-private enterprise, right? You've got homeowners putting up their own equity. A lot of times we want people to be working with housing counselors, which are funded by government often. We think it's really important that there be sort of a triple bottom line, right? Benefit for the homeowner, benefit for the community, the neighborhood, and benefit for the tax base. So we think everybody should be invested. And often it can be a short-term investment. Housing counseling is a very cost-effective way to invest in long-term housing outcomes. Both on the front end, on the stabilization side as well. So I think by nature of what we've been doing for many years, it is a public-private partnership. I don't think it's the type of investment where, from a budgetary perspective, you couldn't put $1 in next year and then not have it in the following year. All of the colleagues who work in this field are fighting, fiercely to preserve CDBG funding, home funding, SHOP funding in the HUD budget, because these flexible sources of funding are critical for maintaining the boots on the ground that really help people do this work. So I think that we can call it a public-private partnership. The center was started through a partnership of philanthropy, government, and corporations. But at the end of the day, we need government in there as well over the long term. It can't just be in there on day one.
Well, and you talk about counseling, but I would, just because I'm in the finance background,
Sure.
In financing the mortgages that we get to Americans, and I'm going to kick it over in that segue over to Joel, we're looking at GSE reform. Fannie and Freddie have been in conservatorship way too long. There have been many, many proposals out there. We talk about bringing private sector back into the mortgage market to help people get access to mortgage credit, which is how they become homeowners. But there does need to be a government backstop. Some of the plans don't have that. Most of them do. Where do you see GSE reform going this year? And with so much out there in the administration this year, do you think that it's really going to happen this year?
Right, thanks. So again, thanks for having me, and really appreciate being here with my fellow colleagues too. The way we think about GSE reform, there are sort of three main pillars, if you will. So the importance of protecting the taxpayers. So, just having that, having the backstop, but also having the private funds available to keep the markets running. On that note, in order to attract private investors, you do need a rate of return for them. So in that sense, then you need regulatory oversight, you need supervision, and just sort of for that market to really work. And then last but obviously not least, we have the access to credit and the cost to borrowers. So the third piece of that, and it's really sort of balancing those three, right? So for the first two, they all sort of spill into impacting what borrowers end up sort of paying, sort of the all-in cost of the loan, if you will. So the biggest thing is really just sort of balancing those three factors and moving that forward. We have a paper out there now. You probably covered that too, and so the details are there, but those three are the most important things.
But credit
factors.
is really important,
Right.
Especially for the youngest homeowners. And I would encourage you all to jump in and argue with each other if you would like, because that's what makes it
Right.
fun for them, right? We talk a lot about millennials not being able to get into the housing market, younger people, because they have a lack of credit. They don't have the scores. They don't have the money for the down payment. They don't have the credit history. And today, supposedly, the mortgage market is so much stricter, although some would argue that it's not quite as strict as it was 5 years ago, even that we're starting to see more programs. But when it comes to home ownership, and I know you have done a lot of work in this area, John, there's this balance of people saying, well, millennials don't really want to own homes anymore. They want to be flexible. They saw what happened in their parents' generation. They see renting as just fine. There's no stigma attached to it at all. And then others say, well, once they age into that section of, into that area of being married and having kids and wanting the house in the suburbs, that's when they're going to buy homes. But we also have more than 1 million new single-family rental homes, thanks to the crisis, out in America. So if you want to live in a great school district out in the burbs and raise your family with a backyard, you can also rent. It's not all apartment buildings. What do you see as the reason millennials have not jumped in?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and I should start also by repeating the thanks to HUD for including me in this conversation. The heart of that question is, has something fundamentally changed in the way that young people think about homeownership? And the best answer I can give you based on evidence is that we don't have a consistent time series over time to answer that conclusively. But the evidence that we do have suggests that I haven't seen anything to suggest that there is. And so I want to point to a couple of pieces of evidence and then tie back to the first question about reasons for homeownership. So the first is, in survey data, if we ask households, do you either own a home today or aspire to own one in the future or expect to own one in the future? About 83% of people expect to own a home at some point in the future. That's actually consistent across every age group. It's the highest, it's about 90% among those younger than age 30. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some longer-term shift away, but it doesn't tell a cohesive story about millennials turning their backs on homeownership. The second is that if we ask young people about what are the biggest barriers to homeownership, we're not getting answers about, well, I've run the math and I think that the financial return is greater by putting the money in my IRA or my 401k. What we get are the economic factors. We get responses about building credit history, about saving for a down payment and closing costs, about having sufficient income. And the standard or sort of the economic components of being able to afford a home. And so in looking at millennials, at least in the data I've seen, there's a consistent trend that there is some delay in household formation, there is some delay in marriage and childbirth, but that points to a delay in entry to homeownership and not a reduction in the number of households that eventually attain homeownership. And so in trying to think about the struggles that are facing millennials today and how to potentially broaden access to homeownership, I think it comes back to those economic factors. I'll leave it.
And it also comes back to those that are out in the market, can't find what they want to buy. You know, we keep talking about millennials who are on the older side and 35 years old, perhaps at the leading edge, that they're getting out into the market now, and they're finding the hardest time finding a home, finding an affordable home to buy. It's not that they don't have the credit or the down payment, but there's just nothing out there. And the home builders are not catering to that starter entry level demographic. And I know every time I go to the Realtor conference, press conference every month, and we hear about home sales, which have been falling. The numbers have been weak the last 2 months, and Lawrence says over and over again, there's just not enough inventory out there, especially on the lower end. We see the drops in the under $100,000 level. How do we get millennials, how do real estate agents guide millennials into this market, into home ownership, when the builders are not catering to them?
Well, I'm glad that HUD is holding this conference, and for Secretary Carson to recognize the importance of the home ownership. And as John mentioned, the aspiration for ownership is there. 80%, close to 90% wanting to own a property at some point. And housing market, 10 years ago, the problem was lack of buyers. Today, the home sales are falling not due to lack of buyers, but just because lack of supply that is available on the marketplace. So that is the constraint that's holding back. And as Secretary Carson has mentioned, there are many metrics that shows that housing market is on a better footing, recovering, going upward, upward, upward. But one thing that is not working right is that home ownership rate being at essentially 50-year low. So we have the aspiration to become owners remaining very high, yet people who own to own, that dream is not being realized. Now, one of the things that we have constantly mentioned from the Realtors Association perspective is the lack of inventory, and consequently, as a result, the prices are rising too fast and hurting affordability. Just to illustrate, over the past 5 years, home values have risen by 40%, while wages have risen only by 10%. 4-to-1 ratio. One cannot have this mismatch continuing. So we have a situation where housing market is recovering, but somehow it just does not feel right. And that not feeling right is that home ownership rate is at a 50-year low.
Well, then how can we all sit here and argue that home ownership builds wealth? I mean, that was the very first thing you said, was that we need to get into home ownership in order to build wealth. That's what the middle class does. But if home prices are so far out of whack and we're going to over leverage ourselves to get into a home, then how are we going to build wealth?
Well, I think we need new tools, right? So I think in many cases, we're trying to solve 2017 problems with 1987 tools, right? Both on the marketing side, on the lending side, and on the assistance side. So, for example, in New York City, we recently changed our down payment assistance program to go from $15,000, which, if you know the prices in New York City, is not sufficient, up to $25,000, and which makes a big difference. We increased the AMI level as well, the area median income requirement. So it was pegged to 80% of AMI, which was, again, really difficult to make it match prices in the area. And with that increase, we saw a lot more folks come in and were able to actually successfully complete a purchase. So better down payment assistance tools that match market needs that really can help first-time home buyers get in. You can structure down payment assistance to have it recycle so that it's not, so that it's an investment that pays back the public investment over time. I think we also need to look at the mortgage market as well to make sure that we're allowing folks to buy the product that is out there in a responsible way. We hear about a lot of communities, not just in New York, but across the country, where there may be some deferred maintenance in properties coming through the many years of the foreclosure crisis, and conservative lenders may not want to lend on a property that doesn't have, that may have some repairs that are needed. So the state of New York is actually putting out a mortgage product through their Setting May program that comes with some repair money as well as a reduced mortgage rate targeted at certain communities where they're trying to get folks to move and invest. So I know that in areas like Detroit, that's really important. You need to be able to both fix up the properties where there may not be value there, and that's where we need a little bit more flexibility from the lender. So we need better tools on the government side, and we also need, I think, flexibility on the lending side.
But back to the fundamental question of, does home ownership build wealth? I mean, in your surveys, when you see that there's this aspiration to own, is the aspiration to own because it's a status thing, because it's a stability thing, or because people really think, I'm going to make a whole lot of money in the housing market?
Yeah, so all of the above. And that's just to put my academic hat on for a second, I'll say it depends, or all of the above. But I want to touch on each of those. So one is the prospects for homeownership to build wealth. So our estimates, we take the PSID sample of people who in 1999 were either owners or renters. Those who stayed renters through 2013, on average, saw a median change in their net wealth of $0. Their net wealth was around $2,000 during that entire period. Those who were renters, became owners, sustained home ownership, saw their median net wealth increase by $85,000, from under $10,000 to about $99,000 in 2013.
But you're talking about a very strange point in our housing history.
Those who were renters in 1999, bought homes, and lost the home, saw a median decrease in their net wealth of $3,000. That's a decrease, and that's damaging, and that's painful to families, and we should do what we can to avoid it.
They lost $3,000
on median. The difference in their net wealth
by losing
between
their
1999 and 2013
because they didn't put any money into their house
was $3,000. So that's not necessarily just what happens in their house. It's their total median net wealth in 1999 versus 2013. Those who were renters became owners and then returned to renting. Saw a median decrease in their net wealth of $3,000.
Was a lot of that because during the housing boom, people bought their homes with zero down? I mean, nothing in it at all.
It could be that's part of it, and that's right. If you don't,
because
if you didn't have equity in the home,
20% down and you lose it to foreclosure, you're losing that 20% if you haven't lost that wealth.
Exactly, and so part of that question is how broadly do you allow households to take that risk? So the second piece of this is we started with the financial side. To the first question that you asked, I want to add, I think one of the core benefits of homeownership, that certainly there's a wealth component, but stability is the other. So when we do literature reviews of the benefits of homeownership for child well-being, for health outcomes, for other things, for other measures of well-being, stability of being able to stay in the same home and stability of the payment and predictability of that payment are some of the metrics that are central to those analyses and that show the largest benefits.
Even
And so
with the
I
change
wanna
in the
talk about
single-family rental
both of
market
those.
now that there are so many more single-family rental homes?
So
You're looking in
those-
horror at me.
So
You're looking
certainly,
No, I
single
think
family.
there's fluctuation in rents. I don't think there's as much stability in the rents, and we've seen, what we hear is that investors charge sometimes 30% more for those single-family homes than a homeowner would pay.
Right, to start, but they're holding on to, whereas a lot of people thought that the investors were going to sell these homes and get rid of them, they are holding on to them in thousands and thousands. You talk to the folks at Blackstone, and they see this as a very long-term play.
And are their rents stable? I mean,
Well, they're not changing, they're not varying widely. They're higher because some of these homes are more expensive, and you're getting a 3-bedroom house as opposed to a 3-bedroom apartment, it's going to cost you more.
Well, Blackstone's, they are coming into play because they have the capital to utilize it, and this is where I think for the Main Street Americans have to have equal access in fighting off Blackstone's to say that I want that home. And the way to do that is, FHA has played a critical role in providing opportunity for first-time buyers. The social benefits of home ownership, things like children's test scores at school or SAT scores are substantially higher for homeowner compared to renter of similar socioeconomic circumstances. Jonathan mentioned about the health outcomes and so forth. They're all positive social outcomes. However, when there was a foreclosure, all those social benefits collapsed. It actually turned negative. So we need to assure that when we are promoting home ownership, that it is a sustainable, successful ownership and not an artificial bubble ownership that leads to foreclosure, because that is completely harmful in terms of the wealth destruction as well as the negative social consequences from it. But I think we overcorrected downward and certainly trying to provide, say, public-private partnership to bring additional access to mortgages are all good. But I think one other component is we have to increase supply. By increasing supply, it would tame the home price growth and therefore make it more accessible for middle-class, first-time buyers to become owners. So we need to increase supply to tame the home price growth.
Well, and you also have to open access to mortgages, right? But, we did overcorrect on the mortgage side, but there are not a lot of products out there. You look at FHA, you say, okay, that's a 3.5% down, and I realize we were in the home of FHA here, but the premiums are high now, and there was going to be a premium cut, and then there wasn't. What do you see the mortgage market in its current form being able to do to help home ownership?
Right. So we have seen an expansion of credit supply from, again, to your point, from investors who are willing to buy FHA products and loans, and so we have been seeing growth in that throughout 2017, pretty much. The other side of that is on the jumbo side. We've also seen growth there for different reasons, but just want to sort of set that up. I think as far as credit availability goes, there are a few things that come to mind. Christy brought up a good point about sort of modernizing our processes, and one of the things that has been discussed, one of the issues that has been discussed is credit scoring. So that's one aspect that has to be sort of updated over the years, and that might change the pool of eligible borrowers if we can more accurately assess their credit. So that's one major item, and I also think that and along with that, we've been working. The industry has been working on a lot more, spending a lot more money in technology. So I think technology, again, in this generation is critical. It's hugely important for many different reasons. One is really from the sort of customer experience side of things, sort of educating the borrower, making sure the transparency is there as you go through the loan process, and then when you have sort of internal transparency and coordination, for all organizations or any kind of product or service, it just is a better product, so to speak. So the innovation there, I think, is going to contribute to improvements in the mortgage process, and ultimately helping borrowers sort of understand the process better, and to the point of sustainable and affordable credit.
It's
growth.
interesting you bring up technology because
Right.
there are a lot of new companies out there. They're pitching us all the time to talk about their new app or this new thing that's going to make millennials understand how to get a mortgage, because apparently millennials don't understand, but every other generation did understand. And so we have to have this app that has 3 steps, and you have to be able to get a mortgage in 7 minutes so that, and you're pre-approved and everything. And that seems to be the way technology is going. And, it's a slippery slope to get back to where we were once before. Certainly there are not the investors and the chopping and slicing of mortgage-backed securities that we had back then, but this push to get mortgages out to millennials as fast as possible and get their credit scores, we started to mess with credit scores a little bit on what's in the score, what's out of the score, was there a student loan in the score anymore. We're changing the methods again. I start to see the edges coming back in. At what point?
Well, just to clarify, when I was talking about the bar experience, it's really sort of from the, I guess, notification or transparency standpoint. So there's no more sort of fine print type issues, right? And just sort of
people understand that they do actually have to make a monthly payment.
Right, exactly. It's not so much a let's get it done quickly, more so than sort of an ease of having the stack of papers in front of you that not everyone will go through or can go through.
That really has to be acknowledged, the role of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and pushing for clear, plain English and limited English proficiency access around these terms is really, has to be acknowledged, and we're fighting to protect the CFPB every day for those reasons. And people really do need to understand what they're getting into on the mortgage contract.
Yeah, and if I can add to that just quickly, housing counseling has a critical role to play there too. Now, that may not, the scale of housing counseling may not reach every potential borrower, but in our focus groups of home buyers who went through the counseling process, one of the things that comes out strongly from them is the reduction in stress in navigating the home purchase process, that having gone through that process, having connected with a counselor, having someone that they know that if they're interacting with an agent or with a mortgage broker and a red flag goes up, they have someone that they can call and ask, is this something I should be concerned about? Is this standard practice? Anything else? And so just to highlight the role of potentially having advice throughout that process or a counselor to turn to.
Yeah, it's a very low cost effectiveness on the counseling. Veterans Affairs Mortgage, which is not part of HUD, but one thing we recognize in the zero down payment Veterans Affairs mortgages is that it has performed quite well even during the downturn, even with zero down payment. And when we ask realtor members about their clients why this occurred, and they often say that if somehow a soldier misses a payment, quickly a drill sergeant will call them up and say, what's going on? Not as a threat, but more as a trying to help out what's, part. So pre-purchase counseling as well as post-purchase counseling, I think goes a long way in assuring that we have a successful ownership because we know that through the life changes, for a few people, it's a very disruptive process of losing job or certain hospital bill that arises.
If I can add one more. HUD right now is in the field with the largest randomized experiment of pre-purchase housing counseling. So I should disclose that I'm an advisor to it, but nonetheless, they've successfully recruited 5,800 potential first-time homebuyers in 28 cities around the country that are randomized into 2 types of housing counseling and a no-services control group that can be used to understand the experiences of first-time homebuyers as they go through that process. So the full first round of impact analysis will come out middle of next year, but there's an early insights report that's available on HUDuser.com or .gov, HUDuser.gov, and there's 4 measures that they measure impacts for. 3 of them show positive effects. One of them is the likelihood that a home buyer will reach out to their mortgage lender before missing a mortgage payment to see if there is a possibility of forbearance or a repayment plan or some other intervention that might help them avoid foreclosure. So certainly promising prospects for successful outcomes and more to come.
It's important to talk about some of the drivers for that could put somebody at risk, and it's not a lot of the things that people associate with the foreclosure crisis, right? It's, as Lawrence mentioned,
divorce,
it's a medical bill, right?
Yeah.
It's death in a family. They're life events that we need to plan for, and we need to be able to help, and we can help. I think 1/3 of the folks who apply to our mortgage assistance program, which is a 0% grant that can be repaid when you have the ability to do so, when you either refi or sell the home. A third of them said unexpected medical costs were a driver for their default. But again, it's a very cost-effective housing counseling, and these short-term investments are a great model around the public-private partnership, where you can get in there early, have a good success, and then get somebody back on their feet. So there are a lot of myths around what drove people into default during the foreclosure crisis that we will be trying to bust for years.
Well, it's interesting you make it sound a little bit like it's hard to find housing counseling. We need to put more money into it. But all I seem to hear, and I know a lot of this is PR, and I'm certainly not defending any big banks, but a lot of the big banks, the Wells Fargos out there, which I know is kind of a dirty word right now, but the big banks have started these huge counseling programs. They have portals that they want to get into, the 3% down payments. You have to have counseling there are a lot of other groups that are, and maybe they're just bombarding me with PR and I'm being the dumb journalist or something, but all I hear about from banks is we have the greatest counseling programs for if you have trouble, we have the hotline, we have these web portals where you have one direct person that you're going to be talking to, and maybe that's all a big myth, but that's what they seem to be selling right now.
Well, let's talk about what HUD-approved housing counseling is. It's independent. If you're in distress, if you're in foreclosure, it should be free. It's provided by a certified, trained professional, and it's provided by a nonprofit, right? So this is somebody who doesn't have skin in the game. So I'm not sure whether the banks are talking about their outreach to distressed borrowers in a way that...
No, it's a lot to new homeowners, to new borrowers.
To new borrowers.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's over 2,000 HUD-certified housing counseling groups in the country. There's a lot of great folks out there, but we think we could increase the number of people that get access to housing counseling by sort of tenfold to really penetrate. So there's way more need than we have capacity right now, and we think that I'm really happy to hear that you're getting bombarded with that, because we really want consumers to understand what housing counseling is, and we often hear that folks don't hear about it until they're about to go to closing, right? And so that's, you've got your contract signed, the appraisal's done, you've had the house inspected, and then somebody says, oh, you need to go to a 6-hour, counseling course. So that's not the way we really want to integrate housing counseling into the full life of the loan and the full loan origination process. So we want folks to be talking to housing counselors way earlier than that on the pre-purchase side, and again, on the stabilization side, we want people to be getting help as soon as they're at risk of missing a mortgage payment. So the earlier you talk to someone, the better your outcomes will be.
But do you think enough young people, and I say young in their early 30s, who might be those first home buyers, I also I get so many studies every day, I can't even tell you, but everybody wants to send a study about, the big one seems to be millennials don't know anything about how to buy a house. They don't know that they can get a mortgage. They don't know that you don't have to put 20% down. Is this, again, just more PR? Or, I mean, Lawrence, you're out there with people who sell houses every day.
In fact, we take survey of consumers consistently on various metrics, and then regarding the mortgage availability, there is a misperception. Many millennials believe that they have to save up for 20% down payment. They do not understand that FHA mortgages would be available at 3.5% down payment. Of course, insurance premiums are added on, additional costs. Now, yeah, we believe that insurance premium could come down a bit because now it has surpassed the legal threshold of the capital reserve requirement. But I think many people just have misunderstanding about what they can access, and therefore they don't even try. Sometimes there is a natural, heavy human inertia doing the same thing. So many renters, they are continuing to rent, and they are saying, well, certainly I don't have 20% down payment.
But even when their rent goes up and they're
but
paying
when the rent goes up,
$2,200 for a studio
so when
in
the
DC?
rents begin to click up, that's when they begin to search heavily. But I think the whole home buying process should not be an urgent trigger just because suddenly one rent increase in 1 month, but it should be a planning process. And people should understand that there are some mortgage product that is out there that has succeeded very well, including FHA at a very low down payment.
So if it's not the mortgage and it's not the aspiration, I would love to hear from each one of you, what is the greatest barrier right now to home ownership? How do we get back from 64, maybe not to 69, but 66% or something? What is the greatest barrier standing in the way that we need to get rid of?
I think it's affordability. We just haven't seen wages keep pace with the cost of the housing, and we also still see a lot of folks. You know, there may be full employment, but they're working 3 jobs, and one of their job may not be on the books. So it's really challenging to put together, a mortgage application when you've got 3 TaskRabbit jobs and some Airbnb income. And I'm not saying that that's the typical income stream for a millennial. But affordability is definitely an issue. We have a changing economy, and that makes it hard. And I think people are well informed, and there's really just a lack of affordable product. We know people want to buy in New York, and they're looking for all of the options that they can find.
Let me throw a stat back out, and then I'll get you. I was at a panel, I think that Lawrence was on maybe 3 or 4 months ago. Dr. Robert Shiller is a Nobel laureate who is, created the S&P Case-Shiller Home Price Index. And it is now, I believe, a couple of percent. We're back to peak levels in home prices from where we were during the housing boom. And we talk about, growth in home prices up 45% from the crash. When I put the question to him, well, housing is not affordable, he told me that I was dead wrong. That housing affordability today is no different than it was in the 90s if you account, you can use the index and say, well, the index is higher, but if you account for inflation, housing is no less affordable than it has been historically today. Discuss.
Well, mortgage rates being at historic low is certainly helping on the affordability front because we have to recognize 1980s mortgage rates were averaging about close to 10% on average over the whole decade. The 1990s, I believe it was close to 8%. So to have a 4% mortgage rates of today is certainly helping on the affordability. Now, affordability may be less challenging if the mortgage rate was to slide down to 2% over the next couple of years, but no one anticipates that. So mortgage rate, if anything, will be rising, which means now it's the home value that will be the critical factor. We did some analysis of the live inventory of homes that is available for sale in a couple of states. One in California, a median income earner in California would have access to only about 15% of inventory that is listed.
But you're picking California, that's not fair.
Now in Indiana, a median income person would have access to about 70 or 80% of the listing that is available. So again, that is implying that affordability matters because California prices are roughly 7-8 times higher than in Indiana. So a way to address, again, the home values, which has been rising very quickly in California and other parts of the country, is to somehow tame that price growth. And there has to be an increase in new construction in those areas.
Yeah, and if I can add something, the geographic variation in affordability here is critical too. So it's true that the nominal price index is back near to its peak. It's also true that the real price index is still below. If we look at the variation across regions and within metro areas, there's substantial variation too. So I just want to give a couple of numbers. So if we look at the 100 largest metro areas in the United States, in nominal terms, in 41 of them, on average, home prices are back to their nominal peak. In 32, they're still down 15% or more. If we look at individual neighborhoods within metro areas, we see the same pattern, that essentially that higher income neighborhoods have essentially retained or passed their previous peak. And in lower income neighborhoods, there's a measurable lag. Now, obviously, the size of those lags varies depending on if we're in Seattle or San Francisco or in the Rust Belt. But it's critical when you're talking about affordability to acknowledge the extent of variation across areas. And there is, the State of the Nation's Housing Report this year will include a number of maps and data tools to try to better put some images and figures to that variation.
I was going to say relative, I mean, if relative to the rental costs, I think it really kind of depends how you slice and dice the affordability indexes or the various measures out there. I think relative to rents, affordability is not too bad. I'm not going to say it's great, but to your point, if you're paying $2,000 in rent for a studio versus paying $2,000 or something like that for a mortgage, I think you can sort of argue that it's affordable in a sense. But if we're just looking at income growth and affordability, then it's sort of a different approach.
Affordability also plays into the supply situation. That's
Right.
such a big problem because you have a lot of people who are sitting on houses that are not listing their homes because it costs way too much to move up from that starter home to that mid-level home or that mid-level to a little bigger home. I'm sitting in my house right now. I may have lost value on it that in some neighborhoods it's definitely come back. We talk about home prices are back to normal, but there are still a very low, I forget what the number is, but something like 1 million people, 1 million homeowners who are still underwater on their homes and cannot afford to move. And then what we call near negative equity, there are even more people who don't have at least 10 or 15% equity in their home, which would allow them to move up. Therefore, that house is not going on the market. Even boomers who would downsize and rent, that home, which would become a +1 in the supply side, they're not moving because they've lost money in their homes or because, they don't want to sell and lose into the market. So it plays into the supply side, and when Lawrence then says, well, we don't have enough supply, I mean, the builders aren't going to build it. You'd ask any builder, why aren't you building more homes? They say the margins are not there.
Right, so just to sort of highlight the magnitude of that issue, using our purchase applications data, if you look at it by loan size buckets, if you will, the size of the purchase application market below 400,000 is about 80% of the market, and then 400,000 and up is only 20%. So to your point, if you need someone to sell in order for someone to buy, those transactions are not happening. And when you have 80% of the market that's sort of not growing as quickly as the upper 20, those opportunities are lost. So that's just sort of
The wealth divide.
adding some data to your...
We can't ignore the role of investor capital in this. Blackstone's long-term projections notwithstanding, what we see is that even when there is an affordable home that would be affordable to a working family who has good credit and who can get a mortgage, they get beaten at the stoop by somebody with a bucket of cash. And these are people that are looking to buy low, put a little bit of money and flip and get out. They're not looking for long-term, to hold properties long-term and be long-term landlords. They're really looking at housing as an investment and as a way to extract value. And it's very, very challenging if you're trying to build a neighborhood when you're constantly seeing properties flip and families can't afford to stay. So it's an issue that we have to grapple with as an industry. It's not apples to apples if you're having an investor compete with, a first-time home buyer, whether they be a millennial or from any other generation. It's just really challenging.
I've been told I need to open it up to questions. I know you've got more to say. You want to say one more thing? Or
go ahead.
Okay. We have questions that are supposed to come up on, oh, there they are. Well, let's start from here. From Melissa. How do the use of current credit scoring models hurt or help Hispanic and African American households as well as millennials? Who would like to take that?
There are 40 million adults in America who don't have credit scores. They are credit invisible, and it's almost impossible to buy a home other than trying to save up 100% so they can buy all cash. So the alternative credit model, so if someone is paying utility payments on time, credit card payments on time, the rents on time, those should be a consideration, because whether it is a recent immigrant, sometimes it's catch-22. In order to get a established credit or credit card, they need to have a credit, but they don't have it, which goes first. So I think we need to recognize there are a large number of adults who don't have any credit, and so trying to look towards alternative scoring method and have access, and even if it's a test pilot case, so just roll it out slowly, and if they are successful homeowners, then they can begin to expand more.
I think to follow up with that is also people with who are self-employed or have alternate forms of income that may not be documented as clearly. So to add on to Lawrence's point, that sort of is another hindrance.
I was just going to say a lot of folks with very, very good credit still can't get mortgages, right? So there's data that the Urban Institute put out recently showing how tight lenders are around that, and how they're over, as you said before, they've overcorrected. And so folks with upwards of 700 credit scores still can't get a mortgage. So it's, it's another factor.
There are folks at the microphone, if you'd like to step up. Ladies first.
Is it on? Oh, now you can hear me. I am a millennial that is looking to buy and am qualified to buy as of like a month or 2 months ago. And I have been preparing for the last 2 years to purchase and am now terrified because I notice the interest rates are going up. And I'm a little nervous that they're going to continue to go up, but I'm in the same boat where I can't necessarily find an affordable unit in the DC metro area. And I'm looking specifically in DC. So do you think this is going to continue to happen, and should I just bite the bullet? Or do you think that there is something to be said about waiting even a couple of months?
I mean, interest rates haven't really gone up that much. When you look at where they've been varying here and there, they actually went down pretty significantly in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
If you say right after the election, they did jump from below 4% to 4.5%, came back down. Now we're down around 4%. I mean, I bought my first apartment and was so psyched to get 9%. 9%. My dad helped me with it, and he was like, "We did good." So you have to put it in perspective. That is a half percentage point, 25 basis point fluctuation. I mean, I don't think you guys know better, but your projections are not that mortgage rates are going to be up around over 5% even this year, right?
Not this year. So we are projecting mortgage rates to hit about 5% next year. But
now.
That being said, there's definitely a lot of rate volatility going around, and you've probably seen too, if you're tracking it, rates have, to Diana's point, have gone up and down. Now they're sort of net, even where we were pre-election. But not saying that you should speculate, based on where rates move. I think that locking it in is definitely important if you can, but we're not expecting a dramatic rise in rates. I think the economy is always going to be susceptible to sort of, whether it's an external type factor that's going to push rates back down. So.
And I think we should also always understand that when we talk about the Fed raising rates, that doesn't always correspond directly to the rate on your 30-year fixed or whatever mortgage you're looking for. It really has a lot more to do with the bond markets and what's going on in international and what the president decides to do that freaks out investors. I mean, it's just, I wouldn't focus entirely on the Fed and hearing that rates are going to go up. Watch CNBC, we'll help you with that. Next question.
Hi. So we sat through the presentation and we heard the number 63% mentioned several times as far as the homeownership rate goes. But my understanding is that rate is a little bit different when we break it down by race. So what we have had from back to 1995, we had around 71, 73% homeownership for whites. Today it's at 72%, or 71.8 to be exact. But minority homeownership is down 41, 43 neighborhood. I have not heard anyone mention it, so I would love to hear your perspective on why is this growing divide, and two, what can we do to make this a part of the conversation more pointedly?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right that the homeownership rate trajectories differ in meaningful ways by race, and that the recovery or that the downturn since the 2004 peaks are smaller among whites and among Hispanics than they are among black households, and that likely relates, I don't have data directly tying those two, but I think it almost assuredly relates to concentrated lending patterns in minority communities and the consequences of foreclosures. So when we look at the last 10-year drop in the overall homeownership rate, we can explain about half of that by our estimate of the number of owner-occupied foreclosures. And so I think responding to it involves looking at both ends. What still remains to be done in preventing further foreclosures and helping households stay in their homes, and potentially in broadening access to homeownership reentry. But you're absolutely right on the point that we're near a 30-year low.
FHA plays a critical role in first-time buyers, moderate-income families, and also people who are in the minority groups. To the degree that FHA can reduce the mortgage insurance premium, that will begin to facilitate people who have been historically disadvantaged better opportunity to enter the market.
There's an interesting question up on here that someone asks, isn't manufactured housing a great solution to creating inventory at lower price points without government subsidy? Now, I don't know the answer to this question, but maybe you do. Is there appreciation in manufactured housing? Does a manufactured home appreciate the way a regular home does? And is that perhaps keeping people from buying like they wouldn't want to? Because I've never heard that there's a lack of supply in manufactured housing. Anyone?
It depends.
Maybe we don't have an answer.
I'm not an expert on this, but CFED has a lot of stuff on their website about how manufactured housing can help increase affordable homeownership. So there are different types of loans you can get. It depends on the type of manufactured home. But the push these days is to increase the quality of manufactured housing so that you can get the right mortgages to purchase them, and so that they're sustainable over the long term.
Yeah, and on the market. So we have a study on our website, and I apologize that I don't know the details, but was looking at innovations in manufactured housing outside of Kansas City and in Minnesota, and those may be useful as well.
Okay, next question.
Hi, I'm Rolf Pendahl from the Urban Institute. This follows up on the last in-person question about minority home ownership. African Americans' home ownership rate now is lower than it was when the Fair Housing Act passed. It's 41%. It was higher than that in 1968 at the threshold of HUD's inauguration as a cabinet level agency. And so thinking about exactly where that came from, there's a lot of narrative early in the conversation about renters becoming homeowners too soon, and maybe they weren't ready. But there's a lot of evidence that home equity loans and not purchase loans were really behind the fairly substantial decline in home ownership among African Americans, because you see so many African Americans who already owned homes, who were already owning homes in their 40s and their 50s and in their early 60s. They're losing their homes. And so I'm kind of wondering and hoping you can sort of sharpen the policy angle here about whether there's a difference from a policy standpoint in the kinds of efforts that we need to make to ensure that first-time buyers are getting into homes that they can afford sustainably versus the policy angle on restoring the credit health and the credit history of people whose homes were taken from them often by loan sharks and other speculators who never really had any business being in the mortgage market to start with.
Well, I think first is to assure that for entry-level homes that is available, because currently in the current environment with prices rising, fewer and fewer homes are at the affordable range. So we need to assure that there is some incentive for the home builders to build starter homes, more affordable homes. Does that require certain public-private partnership? If one looks at, say, back in the last time where household formation really shrunk, that is to say people lived with parents and suddenly began to blossom out, that was during right after the Great Depression. There was a war, and that once the GIs returned home, they wanted to form their own household. Yet there was not enough housing available. And suddenly, just rapid increase in housing construction at that time. Now, it would be worth a PhD dissertation topic. Why was that housing construction able to increase so fast during that time, and why not today? What are some barriers that's holding back the builders? But the key is to have the affordable homes, because we cannot have first-time buyers trying to overstretch their budget just trying to afford. But if we have more affordable homes being built, that will clearly help on the supply.
Well, I just want to thank you, Rolf, for your work on this with Alana as well. I think that what you guys have been able to demonstrate at the Urban Institute is that it's so market-specific and neighborhood-specific. These are obviously the micro-neighborhoods where we see the highest concentration of the impacts of the foreclosure crisis, and they are almost exclusively neighborhoods of color. So it's a huge concern, but I think making sure that the products meet the needs of those markets is key. I was referring before to products that allow for purchasing homes that need repair. I think that's one way you could target resources in certain geographies with either reduced interest rates or added benefits to increase the homeownership rate in very specific neighborhoods. But I think getting down to that micro level and looking at the needs by neighborhoods is one of the ways in which you can achieve that policy focus.
I'd like to go back and talk about the value of housing counseling. And so the National Association of Realtors and the Mortgage Bankers Association and the housing counseling industry seem to be coming together to push the value proposition. But how do we engage the Dianas of the world who are being sold on corporate counseling to push product as opposed to getting housing counseling that is non-biased or unbiased? So how do we do that? How do we get that message out much louder and clearer, working with everybody at the table? Thanks.
I guess we will have to talk up more on the importance of housing counseling, because all the empirical evidence shows the very cost-effective, is a very low cost in the greater scheme of things in turning people to become successful homeowners.
And just to add to that a little bit, there's substantial variation in the kinds of curricula that are out there, and that reflects the extent of heterogeneity across borrowers. And so, for some households, they may be able to find what they need on a lender's website. They may be able to find what they need by Googling things. What we focus on in this study, and what's the core of HUD counseling agencies, is more intensive education and counseling sessions that include things like identifying down payment assistance sources, referrals to potential match savings accounts, other loan products. And so I think, I'm not familiar with every potential education source that's out there, but I would say when I'm speaking about housing counseling, at least, I'm talking about counseling that's consistent with the national industry standards, which is a relatively more intensive product.
Yes, hi, my name is Daniela Pierre. I'm from South Florida. And my question is, Fannie Mae recently passed some new policies to help millennials that have high debt-to-income ratio afford a mortgage. From your experience, are the lenders being receptive to that new practice? And do you see that as a way for millennials to break into the mortgages?
And just to explain, that had to do with student loan debt.
Correct.
Well, so.
Right. I think a couple things going on here. So one, some of the feedback that we've heard from the lenders is that the uptake has been slow. I don't really know why that might be, sort of given the opportunities that have been presented. I think you might have the inventory issues obviously is one of the biggest ones. Maybe there's some kind of stigma attached. I don't know. But on the other side of that is also underwriting to student loan debt. I mean, that's been tricky because it depends on the type of repayment and the potential for debt forgiveness. So I think there is still a lot of sort of soul searching that's being done right now to try to underwrite accurately, to holders of student loan debt. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Sort of. There's some new products being rolled out on the state level also that look at the impact of student loans on new mortgages. So Maryland has a program called Earned It, and the state of New York is also trying to increase the down payment assistance for folks that have a recent graduate degree. So I think there's beginning to be movement in the field in terms of innovating new products that can accommodate the fact that there are so many folks that have a very high student debt burden.
There's an interesting question from the Twitter that says, the only way out is to build. How do the panelists think we can fight NIMBY and restrictive zoning permit in municipalities? Now, if you talk to any home builder out there, and I talk to a lot of them, when you say, why aren't you building more homes? Supposedly there are all these people that want to buy them. Doesn't make sense. That's what you do. You sell houses, you build them. They say that the permitting the cost of, all of the regulations, restrictive, environmental, et cetera, it's actually 25 to 35% of the cost of building that house. Now, the president has talked a lot about deregulation. We've seen a little bit in water that the builders got excited about. But overall, the feeling out there is that there is just over-regulation on land and development. Do you all see any changes that would make the home builders suddenly say, okay, it's lifted, anything locally, anything like that? I don't see it down the pike.
Well, in some market, first, NIMBYism is a very strong force where people who are existing owners do not want to change the character of the neighborhood, which they believe that new supply may bring. And I think this is where, some idea of the need of the municipality or the metro market to say, look, the job creation is very strong, but there's not enough housing. For the good of the metro, we need to build more, but where? Is there a way to incentivize, meaning that a certain level of either one can be a carrot, that is, say, provide some financial incentive for the existing owners to allow more building, that will be the carrot, or a stick, which is to say certain public service will become more expensive if you continue to restrict building. But NIMBYism is a very powerful force. But the second part is just regulation related to building, whether it's water right access, so it depends upon locality, and also some lawsuits where many multi-family construction will be ideal for millennials. Millennials want that downtown livability, walkability, yet Denver and Seattle, perfect millennial markets, they're only building apartments. And they're doing so because of the potential lawsuit that will be thrown at the condominium developer if there's a defect. So, trying to change, look at the legal language a little more so that builders feel more confident in building condominium rather than the apartments.
Hi, Doug Ryan, CFED, and since Christy called us out on manufactured housing work, I just want to raise that real quick and then get to something else. So at the end of the day, they can appreciate, but it's related to the quality of the loans, meaning more mortgages, not chattel, fewer chattel loans, who owns it, who controls the land, that can help appreciate, and of course where you are. So all those things matter. But to the earlier point, zoning also matters. Far too many communities zone out MH when they could be a solution for things like infill. But back to the larger point, you talk about the public and private partnership, and I look behind Lawrence and Christy, and I see the word new era of home ownership, and I think there's a bit of irony there. Christy raised the idea that the administration's budget zeroes out CDBG, self-help home ownership, and home, but it also gets rid of the 502 Direct program, which is a low-cost mortgage program in rural areas. It also eliminates legal services, which could help prevent foreclosures. Policies matter, and we can't have this conversation in a federal building without realizing exactly what is happening on the ground. Now, regulatory policy also matters, and there's policies from the majority in Congress, who I'm sure some people in the room support, which will go back to the era, for example, allow portfolio lending to be exempt from the qualified mortgage rule. That's a big deal. That's why two big banks, WAMU and Wachovia, went belly up. Do we really want to revisit that? That's part of the Financial Choice Act. There is a lot on the table that is defining what a new era could be. And I think people need to be wary of what that's going to look like, because there is a lot in front of us, and mortgage policy is home ownership policy. One final point, if I may.
Is there a question?
There is no. Well,
Okay.
Here's a question. One thing no one has raised is the mortgage interest deduction. There is not a credible independent economist that says that adds value to the market. Where are the panelists on that?
We are a big believer in mortgage interest deduction. Home buyers purchase their property knowing that that is in place. It's been in place for 100 years. They think essentially this is established condition. And so to change the law after people have made a purchase, which in our analysis show that it will be home value destruction of roughly 10%. Now, some people may say, well, it doesn't matter. Maybe home value should come down. Well, for the property owners, they don't want to see their wealth being destructed. We understand that Canada, where they don't have mortgage interest deduction, the home ownership rate is very high. I think it all depends upon the historical facts that if we did not have mortgage interest deduction, that it would be, home ownership rate would be modestly lower. If Canada did have, it would be modestly higher from even our current higher levels. But it's all about the current homeowners who have made a purchase, knowing that this was the part of the rules, but suddenly to pull it out from them, I think that would be a surprise. And given that we are in democracy, our realtors are a very active participant of democracy.
I just would like to reframe it as, home ownership for who? The majority of the folks that we work with don't itemize on their taxes, and so they're not able to take advantage of the mortgage interest deduction. So when we have this conversation, I think it's really important to be clear about who's able to really leverage that resource. And if we're really trying to get people into affordable home ownership, we can change the way that we're doing that contract so that it's easier and more accessible for folks to get maybe a tax credit instead of the MID.
We just have a little bit of time left, so we'll take a couple more questions. Let's say those are the last two there.
My name is McKinley Belcher. I'm a HUD employee, and I'm also a former mortgage broker for about 20 years. And what I see and what I've seen listening to you guys here about the issues and things that we're facing in the mortgage business now, housing, is number one, I haven't really heard anyone say anything specific about how do we get more affordable housing for people. I mean, we're talking about $400,000 homes. We're still not talking about the majority of people in the market that make that kind of money for those homes. I think
it's the builders. I mean, the answer is the builders have to build them.
Right. And number two, the problem I see is that it's not so much the counseling for the borrowers that are going in, but the lenders. From personal experience, I know for a fact that some of the people that they put in these homes really shouldn't be in there. Primary example, I won't use their names, but I did a deal where the person, I told them point blank, I don't think you should buy this home because they were dependent on their overtime. Their overtime was about 3 times more as much as what their regular income was.
So your question is, should there be counseling for lenders?
The lenders, there should be, because if you know that the person is not going to be able to, if you're looking at something like that, and we know that's a temporary thing.
Right, but I think the lawsuits that have come after a lot of these lenders have really set them back. I mean, if you look at the billions of dollars levied against lenders who did all kinds of bad things, I mean, that's kind of a lesson right there. That, I mean, sure, there's going to be obviously predatory lending in the future. We're not all stupid. There will be. But I think right now we're talking about a market that's a little too tight, aren't we? Yeah.
That's been the topic, right?
That's been the topic.
Yeah.
And
even for the qualified borrowers, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. Right.
Okay.
Just my 2 cents.
Well, it still comes back to the point, though, there's not equality there. We're saying the buyers need to be counseled, but we're not saying that these lenders are being counseled and
Isn't that what the
being held
CFPB is doing?
accountable.
Again, a market that's too tight, but there are instances of predatory activity. So the rise of land contracts is very concerning in a few places around the country. And you mentioned education for the lenders, but it's what's the balance between making counseling as broadly available as you can and having the stick, so having regulation that limits predatory activities. So I don't want to discount the notion that tight markets eliminate predatory activity, because there is. The question is, how do you best constrain it?
Thanks.
I think just one quick last question, and then we got to wrap.
Thank you very much. My name's Sarah Jurek. I'm with HUD at the Office of Housing Counseling, but my question is actually about the overhang, if any, from the foreclosure crisis. You've talked and given a lot of data about where we are now. I'm curious about things like impact on credit with commercial credit, student loans was mentioned, Also, things like HELOC resets or amortization and loan modifications that are resetting. What is the impact today that still might be felt from the crisis?
We think you have the answer.
Sure. Yeah, I'll add a couple of things there. All of the things that you mentioned, Sarah, I think are overhang. One of the largest questions to me is for those 5 to 6 million owner occupants who went through a foreclosure, what happens now? And our data suggests that most of those households are somewhere between 40 and 65. And so the prospect of re-entering homeownership, the calculus on a 30-year mortgage is very different at that age than it is if you're a 30-year-old. It means that you might be taking mortgage debt into retirement with you. So that group is the clearest example in my mind of the overhang from the crisis, but there's certainly others too. I don't know if anyone else wants to add.
I would just quickly say that, we're still dealing with the crisis every day. We probably have 10,000 homeowners that we're still trying to get through in New York State. So the folks that are on the ground, that are in your network, know the crisis is still very much impacting families on a day-to-day basis. And I think that was acknowledged in the stats that were presented earlier. I think Joel has some stats too.
Well, I was just going to add, I think, we're still looking at a lot of loans in the foreclosure process or that are being held from it in judicial states because of the backlog. So, there's obviously long foreclosure timelines, so these are still unresolved. I was also just going to add that, the lenders have been telling us recently that when there's an opportunity to make contact with the borrower or vice versa, when the borrower is able to sort of come forward and say they have trouble, the success rate has been much higher than if you're looking for someone who's not answering the door, not answering the phone. So the efforts are out there, but it's a two-way street. So sometimes when people sort of panic, right, they can't afford the payment and then they just sort of disappear. So I think that's sort of in the works, and that's being worked on from an industry standpoint. Yep.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for this great discussion. Thank the folks here at HUD for having us, and Secretary Carson, and well done.
And on behalf of HUD, thank you very much for participating and being our panelists, and thank you again, Diana, for moderating this panel discussion. Very insightful, and thank you all for attending and participating and joining the conversation. We look forward to our next forum, and this concludes today's events. Thank you.